So hi third graders, I'm doing another video for you to self-check yourselves on your lesson 2-6, which is estimating sums. So I'm going to continue where we left off, and if you notice we were on number 10, so I'm going to start with number 10 here, and it says in the directions to round to the nearest 10 to estimate. So 75 plus 72 is our expression. And when you don't have an equal sign, they call that an expression, not an equation. And so when we add 75 and 72, we're going to round it to the closest 10. So remember, if you still need to, you're more than welcome to use your multiples of 10 chart. That's a resource that you can do to make sure that you're being accurate with your rounding. Or you can also use your number line, and some of you have created a number line to help you. So if you've created a number line like this, that's also going to be helpful. So let's go ahead and get started. 75, so we have a tens place, which is 70. So it's either going to round to 70, which is in our tens place, or the next 10, which is 80. So 75, we notice that, or remember that in the middle of every group of tens is 5. So 75 is going to be right in the middle. So remember what happens, there's a rule when a number is right in the middle of two groups of tens, we're going to round right up. We're going to round up. So 75 is going to round to 80. Now, remember this little symbol? It's called the about symbol, which means almost or about, around, approximately. There's so many different ways to say about. So 75 rounds to 80. 72. We have 70 in the tens place, so it's either going to round to 70 or the next 10, which is 80. Now, again, 75 is in our middle, but 72 is going to be before 75. So this tells us that 72 is going to round to 70. Now, when we add 80 plus 70, we are going to remember that we can decompose this as maybe numbers that are easier for us to add mentally. So maybe we can add 70 plus 70, and 70 plus 70 is 140, and then 10 more would be 150. If you're getting more than, and I saw an error in adding the other day where somebody had a number up to thousands, reasonably, we can't say that we have even a hundreds place here. So how can we add 80 plus 70 and get 1,000 when we don't even have a hundreds place here? So we have to be reasonable in our thinking when we're adding. So 70 and 70 is 140, plus 10 more is 150. We could also think of this as taking two tens, adding it here to make 100, which would leave us this, which would be 50. So several different ways to kind of think about it when you're decomposing a number. Now we can add 70 plus 70 is 140, and 5 and 2 is going to be 7. And so when we put this together, we are going to have 147. So 147 is fairly close to 150. That is a reasonable estimate. Okay? So looking at number 12, and hopefully you skipped a line in between these to make sure that it's readable. We have 376, and to that 376 we're going to add 295. Now, we're going to round to the closest 10. So we're looking at our tens place to round to the closest 10. So if you use your multiples of 10 chart, you will notice that 376 comes between 370 and the next 10, which would be 380. Now, looking at your ones place, 375 is right in the middle. This is 376. So we're going to round up to 380. We have 295. Again, thinking about the two multiples of 10 that this number comes between. We have 290. And the next 10 can be kind of confusing because we have just now added another 10 to 90 to make the next 100, which would be 300. So it's 300 is a multiple of 10, especially when we have 10 tens that make our new 100. So this is either going to round to 290 or 300. Now, 5 tells us that this is right in the middle, and so we're going to round up to 300 as our multiple of 10. So 380 rounded to the nearest 10. 300 is rounded to the nearest 10. So when we add these, we add 300 plus 300 is 600. And we have the 80 here. So it's going to be about 680. Now, when we add 376, we can think about this as adding 300 here and then subtracting 5 to make it easier for ourselves if we wanted to. Because what is 300 minus 5? It's 295. That would make it easier for us here. So if I didn't want to have to go through all the stages, I could just think of it this way. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and add 300 plus 200, which is 500. 70 plus 90 is 160. And 6 and 5 makes 11. Now, if I think about this as an algorithm, and I line these up, and I'm lining these up, again, thinking about our place value, this is super important to remember that 500 plus 100 is going to give me 600. And then if I'm thinking about using expanded form, add that 600 to 60, which would make 660, plus 10, which would be 670, plus 1 would be 671. So 671 is our exact amount when we add this together. 680 is our estimated amount when we rounded it to the nearest 10. So again, we could use our understanding of the algorithm. We're still going to get 671. Okay? So now, if I wanted to look at number 14. Let's look at number 14 and round it to the closest 100. So I'm going to, I don't know why I said if I wanted. We're going to. It's not a want to situation, I guess. So 14, I'm going to have you self-check yourself. So I have 462. Drop my cap. 462 and 251. And again, we're rounding to the closest 100 this time. So you're going to have to shift your thinking from rounding to the nearest 10 to rounding to the nearest 100 now. So let's shift our thinking to the hundreds place where we're going to look at the hundreds instead of the tens now. Okay, so 462. It's between 400 and the next 100, which would be 500. Now, again, if you're wanting to be accurate, you want to make sure that you're going to use maybe your chart. So 462 would be right about here, between 460 and 470. But again, remember, we're looking at rounding to the closest hundred. So you'd have 400, 400, 400, and 500. So remember to look at your tens place. 50 is right in the middle, or excuse me, yes, 50 is in the middle, and this is going to be 60. So we know that that's going to be over our curve of the 450, because 450 is right in the middle. So 462 is going to be on that other side of the 450 mark, okay? So now we're going to round it up to 500 because it's past the 50. Same thing for 251. We look at the tens place. It's either going to be 200 or the next 100, which is 300. We know that 50 tells us that it's going to be, even though it's one past it, it's only one past 50, but still, it's going to round up to 300. So now we're going to take we're going to take a look at our rounded numbers and add them together, and 5 hundreds plus 3 more hundreds is going to give us 8 hundreds. So when I add this exact amount, this is going to be close to 800. So let's take a look. We're going to add our hundreds. 400 and 200 is 600. 60 and 50, well, I know 50 plus 50 is 100, so one more 10 past 50 would make it 110, and 2 and 1 is going to make 3. So 60 plus 100 is 700, plus 10 is 710, plus this 3 more is going to give me 10 and 3 makes 13, 713. Now, you'll notice that this, if I were to round 713 to the nearest 100, it actually wouldn't round to 800. However, we're just wanting a simple estimate. We don't round the sum, we're going to round the add-ins when we're rounding, okay? So be careful of that. I'm going to go to 16. So on 16, we have 539 and 399. 399. Wow. I wonder what that would round to. That one's actually a pretty easy one to think about when we're rounding to the closest 100. So 539, 500, we're rounding to the closest 100. It's going to be between 500 and 600. 30 tells us that this is going to be less than 50. So again, 50 is our middle mark. Less than 50, we round down to 500. 399, wow, that's only one away from, right, 400. So 300, 4 is going to round up to 400. Well, of course, if it's past the 50 in the tens place, we know that this is going to tell us that we're going to round up to 400. Now that I'm going to add this, I can use this same understanding of how close 399 is to 400 by saying I'm going to add 400 and then subtract 1 when I'm finished adding that 400. Because what is 399? It's 400 minus 1. So I'm going to try and use that strategy. And I'm going to take that 539, add 4 hundredths to the hundredths place here, and that should give me 939. And then if I take this 1 away, because I'm not really adding 399, I'm not adding 400, I'm actually adding 399. I'm going to take that 1 away, and that's going to give me 938. Now, if we look over here at our estimate, which I forgot to finish, but if I add that 500 plus 4 more hundreds, that should give me 9 hundredths. So again, a reasonable estimate. So keep self-checking yourself. Good job. Keep going. Now, remember what I told you about on the next part, compatible numbers? We're still working on rounding numbers, so I would really like for you to stick with rounding numbers. We'll work with more compatible numbers a little bit later, so I'm kind of changing the directions for that. But I wanted you to round it to the closest 10 when you see the word compatible numbers. And definitely you will see compatible numbers more in 4th grade. Compatible numbers are just numbers that are easy to use in your head. So instead of maybe adding 50 plus 40, or excuse me, if you were to say 53 and 47, maybe 50 and 40 is compatible for you. It's going to depend on your comfort level with how flexible you use the numbers. And so we want to kind of continue with the idea of rounding since this is such a new concept to us. So number 18, I said remember to round when you see compatible numbers in your directions, round to the closest 10. So we have 167 plus 27, and we're rounding to the closest 10. So this is going to either be 160 or 170. Now we look at what's in the middle of every group of 10. 5 is in the middle of every group of 10. So this is going to be 165. It's past 165. This says 167. So we're going to round up to 170. And for 27, we're going to round it up, because this is past 5, it's past 25. We're going to round it up to 30. And when I add 70 and 30, if you know 7 plus 3 is 10, 70 and 30 is going to be a new 100. So I have 100 and 100, which makes our 200 for our estimate. Okay? Then we're going to take and find the exact amount. So I'm going to take this 160, since I don't have a 100th place here, and add this 20. That's going to give us 180. And then this is going to be 14. I'm going to add that 14, and this is going to be 194. So 194 is about 200. Number 20, I'm just going to give you the estimates here. So I have 145 and 394. Again, you're self-checking yourself, rounding to the closest 10. This is going to be 150. This is going to be to the closest 10, 400. And I know it's 400, but remember, you're at 390. So the next 10 after 390 is 400. And this would make 550. And if I think of this as 400 minus 6, which I could, because that's what 394 is, it's 400 minus 6. I could do this fairly simply by adding 400 and then taking away 6. So this would be 545 minus 6 would be 539. So 539 is close to or about 550. Okay, so moving along, chugging on right through. We're going to take a look at number 22. Oh, chugging along right through to number 22. We've got, says, estimate to decide if each answer is reasonable. So, looking at 22, they have said that 83 and 46 is 129. Is that a reasonable thought? Well, just think about 40 and 80. If you were to think about using rounding as your indicator, you have 80 plus 50, because if you were to round those, that's what they were round to, and as the closest 10. And 80 and 20 is going to be 100, and then the 30 more is going to be 130. So is that a reasonable answer? Yes, 129 is a reasonable answer. 24, 308. Now think about number 24. If you have 105 and there aren't any hundreds in your hundreds place of 23, how can that be a reasonable answer? So yes, you have hundreds here. You only have one though, but you have no hundreds over here. How could that be reasonable? So if I were to even think of this as 100, rounding to the closest, actually 110, rounded to the closest 10, and this being 20, it would be more reasonable to say that this is going to be about 130, not 308. And number 26, if you look at 328 and 365, you have a 300 and a 300 already in your hundreds. So 695 might be pretty reasonable since you've got a 20 and a 60. A 20 and a 60 would make an 80. So right there, if I'm just looking at my front digits and my tens place, my hundreds place is 600, my tens place is 80. This seems like it might be pretty reasonable. So if I go ahead and round this to the nearest 10, which is 330, and I round 365 to 370, then I would say, okay, well, 300 and 300 is 600. 70 and 30 is another 100. So reasonably, I could say that this is going to be about 700, right? So if I look at, that's pretty reasonable. 693 is pretty reasonable to say, yeah, rounds to 700, that seems like a pretty reasonable answer. Okay, number 28, you're going to use your table there. So the table says Mr. Tyson drove from Gainesville to Tampa. Well, Tampa is 114 miles away from Gainesville. So, and he drove back again. Wow. So not only did he go one way, but he came back. So that tells you that if he went and came, that he's driven the same distance twice, right? So if I have Gainesville, and if I were to just draw myself a picture here, if I didn't understand it, I could just draw myself a picture. From Gainesville to Tampa is 129 miles. So, he drove there, which was 129 miles, and then he drove back. That's a visual representation of what happened in this word problem. So then it says, to the nearest 10 miles, about is the key word here, about how many miles did he drive? So 129 is close to 130. And of course, if he drove almost 130 miles and it's only 1 mile away, if he drove 130 miles there and then he drove 130 miles back, then that tells us that he drove 130 miles twice. So, to and from. So, 100 and 100 is 200, and 30 is going to be 60. So he drove about 260 miles from Gainesville to Tampa. $260 miles. So we're going to label that. So miles to and miles from. Okay, number 30, round to the nearest hundred to estimate how many musicians in all are in the world's largest accordion band and the world's largest trombone band. So together, and. That and word is a key there because it's saying and putting them together. So the world's largest accordion band and the world's largest trombone band. So rounded to the nearest hundred. You always got to go back and rethink about, okay, well, what does that mean? And then we're going to round it. I'm rounding it to the closest 10 or the closest 100. So closest 100, 284 is past 250. So it's going to round up to 300. And those are my accordion, or no, my trombone people. So I'm going to put trombone here. And I'm going to abbreviate it. And then I'm going to add my accordion people. And that's 625. So remember 650 is in the middle. So this is less than 650. So I'm going to round it to 600. These are my accordion people. Oh. And I want to know how many people are in the musician, how many musicians are in both together. So, musicians together. So, together, 300 and 600, 600 plus 3 more hundreds would be 900. So, there are 900 musicians that are accordion and trombone players in the world's largest band. And number 32, communicate. How could you use rounding to estimate? So when you go to explain this, you would tell what you're going to round each number to. If you're going to round it, which one would give you the best or closest estimate? So it doesn't tell you what to round to. It wants you to come up with what you think would be the best way to round those numbers and communicate that. So to me, rounding to the closest 10 would be the most accurate estimate. So to me, I would use 260 and round it to 270. So I would round 268 to 270 and 354 rounds to 350 and added together I would get, so I'm looking at my 350 and my 270, so that would be 500 plus 120, so that would give me 620 as my estimate. So I would get 500 plus 120, which is going to give me 620 as my estimate. Now, maybe you rounded yours and you would communicate yours by rounding it to maybe the closest hundred. Again, they didn't give you that information. They want you to be able to communicate how you would round and estimate based on what your thinking is. So, 34, it's asking you to use compatible numbers. And remember I said when we're talking about compatible numbers, right now, I would just like for you to round it to the closest 10th. Since rounding is such a new concept for us, 229 would round to 230. 672 would round to 670. And when I add those together, I'm going to get 800 plus 100, which is going to give me an estimate of 900 rounded to the nearest 10. So that's our assignment. I'm glad that you watched and double self-checked yourself. The more you practice, the better you're going to get at rounding. So today you'll be working in your practice book page to practice more on rounding using estimating with sums. And so as you continue to do this, it's going to get easier, guys, I promise. And eventually, if you're using your multiples of 10 chart, you won't even need to use it anymore. So have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.